I'm here today with Parker Palmer. Parker is an American author, educator, and activist who focuses on issues in education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. He's published 10 books and numerous essays and poems, and is founder and senior partner emeritus of the Center for Courage and Renewal. So Parker, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to be back on air with you.
Yeah, same here. Absolutely. It was wonderful to speak with you earlier this year. And, this time we're going to be talking about faith, hope, and love during an election. So maybe we could just start by, having you let us know your overall view of the state of the country at this point.
Well, I suppose the one-word answer is dire, worrisome. That kind of vocabulary would work for me. I'm 81 years old, so I've lived through a lot of American political history. And that would, for example, include the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century, especially the 1960s part of that, and of course Vietnam. And I've never seen the country as divided as it is today. And frankly, while I've seen a lot of political machinations that did not seem to me to be in the best interests of American democracy or the people of this country across the board, but as politics tends to be, more in the interests of the power brokers and those who are trying to gain or hold on to or maximize power. I have to say that having seen all of that, I have never seen an administration or a dominant political party that seems as devoted to dividing the country as what's going on at this very moment. People talk about the violence on the streets, but it seems very clear to me that some of that is exacerbated and stimulated by indifference in high places or police state actions that actually make things worse rather than better. So I'm very, very concerned about this state of division and the fact that the classic divide and conquer strategy is being played by powerful people. And to cut more to myself and my fellow citizens, concerned that we, the people, are playing into that game by getting enraged at each other, by hating each other, by caricaturing each other, by refusing in way too many cases to do any work at all on expanding our capacity for a civil conversation in the civic sphere. So that's why I say dire, worrisome. I think the coming election in November of this year, 2020, is arguably the most important election that I've experienced in my 81 years.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on all the various points that you made, and the degree of polarization and degree of divisiveness is part of the reason why I'm doing this webinar series, and titling it What I Am. So let's dive into that a little bit further. What ways have you found to be most effective in speaking about some of these issues with people that don't share your views?
Right. I want to go to that quickly, but I want to say one more thing about the role of leadership in this. And I think
Sure.
leadership not only from the very top, from the White House and from the U.S. Congress, but leadership at every level, all the way down to leadership within our organizations and institutions, including the church. civic associations, neighborhood associations, etc. An image that stays with me, Brian, from the history that you and I were just reflecting on, is the image of President Lyndon Johnson, with whom I disagreed radically in many, many regards, including, of course, Vietnam, and who incited a great deal of violence on the streets by being recalcitrant and insensitive to the feelings of a lot of people, including younger people who saw themselves as cannon fodder and were cannon fodder for that war. He was a Southern senator who, you know, had a set of attitudes that he had inherited from politics in Texas a long time ago. But when push came to shove on the civil rights movement, he worked hand in hand, not always comfortably, with Martin Luther King Jr. And the famous story has been told many times now about him inviting King to the White House when Johnson felt he was close to getting the civil rights legislation of 1964 passed. Had basically talked a lot of Southern senators into going that route. But he said to MLK, he said, Martin, you've got to stop the agitation on the streets, because this is not making my job any easier. And King famously replied to him, Mr. President, you have your job to do, and that's with getting Congress to do the right thing. I have my job to do, which is to continue to lead a nonviolent movement of Black liberation that also involves white liberation, and to keep the pressure on all of you who are in this city holding great power. And they went forth and did exactly that. And Johnson was then able to stand up in front of the US Congress and repeat the "we shall overcome" mantra that had animated, you know, symbolically animated the movement. So that's the kind of leadership we need, you know, leadership that's capable of working across great divides with very high stakes and high visibility. And that's a kind of leadership that we haven't seen for a while on many, many levels. People on one side or the other may try it, but they get rebuffed by the other side. So to go more directly to your question about me personally as a citizen talking with other citizens who don't share my views, you know, as you know, I wrote a book about this called Healing the Heart of Democracy, which came out, I think, in 2011, somewhere around there. And in that book is an extended argument for civil conversation and for ways of holding a civil space. But there's some important provisos that come with that. One is that the only way you can hold a civil space is to value our differences. And one of the things I wrote in the book that I always feel solid about is civil discourse does not mean minding our tongues, as many people seem to think it means. It means valuing our differences. And civil discourse is not civil discourse unless we can express our differences openly and clearly. And of course, do so with decency in language and in tone. But its foundation is valuing our differences and not just making nice on each other. You know, I live in Wisconsin, and there's Wisconsin nice and there's Minnesota nice as part of famous parts of Midwestern culture, but that's not what we need. We need, and to put this in a larger frame, the capacity to hold tension creatively, to not be afraid of tension, to not run away from it as our primitive brains are programmed to do. The primitive brain being the place where the famous fight or flight instinct lives. And so we need to overcome that. And, humankind for centuries, for millennia, has been about trying to overcome that through all kinds of cultural inventions, including education, which are intended to help us hold tensions creatively. But there is no civil discourse just by being nice to each other. There's civil discourse only when we value tensions and hold them in a way that allows them to pull us open to new possibilities of the heart and of the mind, to see a little more fully into something that we haven't seen yet. So one of the cases I make in the book is that the founders of this country, for all the mistakes they made, and God knows they made big mistakes around who was in and who was out when it came to we the people. We know that we the people for them meant white, male, landed, which is gentry, wealth holders. It didn't mean women, it didn't mean Native Americans, it didn't mean enslaved human beings. And it didn't mean white men who didn't own land. So they had a very narrow frame around we the people. But their genius was to provide us a government that is a tension-holding set of machinery, political machinery. The tripartite division of government being the most obvious example that, what the White House can't get right or doesn't get right can be held in tension with what the Supreme Court can or can't get right, can be held in tension with what the US Congress can or can't get right. And when it's operating as it should, which it isn't right now, except in certain hopeful instances, then these tensions are being held in a macro way that helps us hold them in a micro way. So we can talk at some length about practical aids to that. I write about them in the book, to holding tensions creatively on the micro level. But I also say in the book, and I think this is really important, I say in the book that when you add up everyone on the left and right who might well be resistant to what I'm proposing here, to creative tension holding with those who differ from them, and that is on both the left and the right, you probably come up with about 40% of the people who are not really ready, willing, and able for the kind of civil conversation I have in mind, and that I think we need. And I think it's very important to focus on the fact that still leaves 60% of the people who are within reach of this vision, of this possibility. And that's where we should concentrate our energies. I'm left of center. I don't think of myself as a radical unless you define that strictly as someone who wants to go to the roots of democracy and of what it means to be human politically. But I'm a progressive, I'm a Democrat, and I don't like it in my community when we start cannibalizing each other because we have yet to achieve purity of ideological commitment. I've seen, so many instances where people on my side of the fence have weakened themselves and weakened the movement, the progressive movement, by saying, okay, you and I may share the same ultimate goal, but your analysis of that or your sense of how we get there is 10 degrees off from mine. So I'm not going to talk to you. I think it's very important to acknowledge that when we talk about difficulties in talking across lines, we're not just talking about people who are way, way out in right field or left field. We're often talking about people who are just 10 degrees away from us and who are so insistent on ideological purity that they've lost the capacity to engage in the conversation. So with those kind of qualifiers in mind, we can talk about all kinds of things that happen in the micro relationship of talking across those lines. I'll just give one example. We might loop back later to consider more, but I think one of the most workable examples that a lot of people have been working with is the idea of inviting each other to tell stories about life experience that has led us to the political viewpoints we hold, rather than trying to start with the political viewpoints we hold and then throwing those at each other like rocks or weapons. What happens in that kind of rock throwing conversation is predictable. We hit each other, we hurt each other, and we both walk away never wanting to have that conversation again, and not having gone anywhere in terms of creative tension holding. But when you begin with stories, and there are projects that have famously explored this and confirmed this, the human story, like how I grew up, what my father did, the political influences in my youth, what I learned in school that bears on this, personal experiences of either loss or hopes dashed or hopes fulfilled, all of that connects with the other person, and then they tell their story and that connects with me. And we may not change each other's minds, but here's what we've done. We've done something more important than score political points. We have begun to create a sustainable container for conversation that has a chance to persist over time if we stay at this humanizing agenda of talking with each other from a human standpoint, rather than making political, reviewing our list of political talking points and then just tossing that stuff at each other. Time and again, I've seen those kinds of containers hold and continue and then transform relationships and ideas into some real partnerships. And there are notable examples. I write about them in Healing the Heart of Democracy, where this has really worked on the ground. So it's that kind of thing I have in mind when I talk about civil conversation. But I really feel, as I said in the book, that we have to think through the whole infrastructure behind a civil conversation in terms of American history, the structure of our government, and our own capacity to overcome the fight or flight response, right? Which is, frankly, it's about becoming civilized, which the human species keeps working at after millennia of trying.
Well, thank you for those specifics. And I'll have a link to Parker's book in the description section for this video recording. And you'll also be seeing excerpts from that book, Healing in the Heart of Democracy, coming up on the Compassionate Christianity blog and social media. So stay tuned for more on that front. So here, coming into the election, there are obviously all kinds of different policies that many of us would like to see enacted, changed from what they are today. What would you view as the highest priorities in terms of policy change?
Right. Great question. And I guess, there are probably a dozen or two. That's what party platforms consist of, right?
Exactly.
A long grocery list of things people would like. And there's some shifting as time goes on, depending on what's happening in the moment. But, what's at the forefront of my mind these days are things like this. We have to work hard on policy changes around the question, the issue, the tragedy of systemic structural racism. And that begins with education. It's to get people to understand that structural racism exists, is demonstrable, and can be overcome if we can get on board with that idea, and if white people especially will stop taking any talk about racism as a personal insult. You know, I've known and worked with a lot of African Americans, a lot of extraordinary human beings, just as I've had the privilege to do among white people and people of all races. I've never had a person of color say to me, "You're guilty because you're white." And I've never felt that, except maybe for brief moments when I was so incredibly embarrassed by white supremacists in or out of office who are just living refutations of the idea that there's anything supreme about being white. They model the lowest life form I can imagine. And there are people in the news right now that I can point to as examples, as kind of poster children for that. But the guilt for a white person doesn't come from being white any more than the guilt for a black person should come from being born with black skin, although that's the way it works out for black and other people of color. The guilt for a white person comes when you refuse to acknowledge the obvious, which is, in my case, and in I think the case of every white person, I benefit daily and have for 81 years from white privilege. There's just no question about it. I've been able to do things in my career which has been largely lived outside of institutional settings, taking the risks of freelancing and independent work and so forth, because I'm white, and I was able to get, you know, good educational credentials because I'm white. I didn't have skin color as a barrier to either educational or employment opportunities. So I'm very aware that I live drenched in white privilege. And if I don't factor that in to how I look at this whole situation, I'm really missing the point. And I'm intentionally blinding myself to what's really blindingly obvious, which is that people born with black skin, or people of color generally, face discrimination, injustice, structural, systemic racism every day of their lives. You know, my favorite example, frankly, is you can take 10 of the most egregious things that our current president, a white man, has said, put those words in Barack Obama's mouth, and how long do you think his political career would have lasted? It would have been a nanosecond. If Barack Obama had said early in his campaign, I could shoot a guy on Fifth Avenue and get away with it, still win the Iowa primary, his political career would have been over. The Democratic Party would have nominated somebody else. And if that isn't a blatant case of structural racism, of white supremacy, I don't know what is. In fact, I have a pretty active Facebook author page where I often post political stuff conjoined with poetry and so forth, music. And I've become aware that there are so many things our current president says that I can't post on Facebook because they violate Facebook's rather loose community standards. That ought to say something to us, you know, but those are things that we who are white and privileged don't generally look at. I will also say this, and I've said this in my new book, On the Brink of Everything, where I do dive into questions of race. I have come to recognize over the course of the years that I harbor an inner version of white supremacy. I despise the KKK and everything that goes with that. I despise the garden variety white supremacists who march in Richmond, and among whom I'm told are good people, which really stretches my definition of good farther than I'm willing to let it be stretched. That's not me, but who I am is a white person who has unconsciously for many years who thought of white as normative, white culture, white ways, white speech. It's all the elements of culture, white food, white art, as normative. I didn't think they were superior. I just thought they were normal. And wedded to that really unconscious and distorting view of things, I found myself when I was younger in situations where my inner question was, why do they talk that way? Why do they eat that stuff? Why do they like that music? Because it's not normal. And that's a very dangerous place for a head and a heart to be. And so part of the uprooting we have to do is, as I've written and said many times, it's a cop-out for white people to say that white supremacy equals membership in the Ku Klux Klan, or voting for David Duke, or burning a cross on someone's lawn. It equals a lot more than that. And part of our task as white people is to talk to each other about rooting out these seeds of more serious forms of racism, because the notion that white is normal or normative can lead pretty directly to some really bad stuff, like, okay, I'll hire this guy rather than that guy because this guy is white and the other guy I'm not sure about. And there's a lot of that going around, always has been in this country, which has yet to honor its founding promise or assertion that all people are created equal. So, I've just demonstrated that you can take any one item on an agenda like this and go on at some length about it. But we have to work on systemic and structural racism. I think we have to, at this moment in our history, we have to return to support and affirm and demand the critical value of a free press. We are very, very lost in the fake news business, which is an ancient authoritarian strategy for undermining good civic conversation. Because if you can't have a basic agreement on facts, you can't have a civic conversation. And when you have a president who says one thing in the morning and it's right there on video, and then another thing in the afternoon and it's right there on video, and those two things contradict each other, and then the next morning he denies and his followers deny that he contradicted himself. You can't have, if you're disagreeing with facts that are before your eyes at that basic level, you can't have a civil conversation. So a return to sanity around the simple notion that there is such a thing as true and false and right and wrong, I think is a very important educational agenda. We have to take science seriously, again, not simply in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, but in the middle of the environmental crisis. It's one and the same thing, this distrust of science that's driving both of those things. And if you believe in science, and if you understand that the overwhelming preponderance of scientists who study such things will say that human activity is a primary cause of ecological calamity, then if we believed in that, we would have started 50, 60, 70 years ago to to work on averting the climate crisis that is upon us today. And of course, the list goes on and on. We have to work very pointedly, seriously, in a committed manner with strengthening our public schools for everyone. And in my mind, that means strengthening our support systems for teachers, monetarily, structurally, in terms of process, so that we are giving these first responders a lot of attention and a lot of care, rather than making them scapegoats for all of the social problems that the rest of us grown-ups can't figure out how to solve, so we need somebody to blame. We've got to fix our immigration system. Yes, of course, we need new immigration laws that make more sense for everyone. But it's heinous what this country has done in the last 4 years to immigrants and to asylum seekers. It's heinous, it's racist, it's xenophobic, and it's just, in religious or secular terms, it's unacceptable. It's morally unacceptable. Have previous administrations done some things that I don't admire or accept? Yeah, sure they have. And some of us objected at the time. But in the last 4 years, that game has been amped up in a way that's totally transparent as to its motivation. It's a bid to claim power by appealing to the racism and the xenophobia that is unfortunately lodged deep in a lot of American hearts, especially as people look at the statistics that say by the middle of this century, America is going to be over 50% people of color. And that scares the daylights out of a lot of white people who, while they won't articulate it, are feeling, I'm losing my white privilege and I don't like that. Too much attention is going to people who don't look like me or think like me or come from where I come from. So we have a lot of work to do on that front. I'll put a cap on this, Brian. I could go on at length, but I'll put a cap on this by saying this. There are some very, very bright, insightful people these days asking themselves not the question we ought to be asking, we should be in a position to ask, which is, how do we want to tweak and refine our democracy and how it intersects with our economy, and there's how it intersects with capitalism, because there's another obviously big subject to concern ourselves with, the distribution of wealth in this society, which is so grossly unjust. And I mean grossly unjust. There's a lot of thoughtful, intelligent people who are not asking, how do we tweak our democracy to get democracy right? Instead, right now, they're asking, are we involved in an authoritarian drift or a fascist drift or a totalitarian drift, or a kleptocracy drift? They're pulling political science terms out of the history books to try to figure out what's going on these days. And they're not playing games. They're looking at evidence that is very worrisome in terms of what kind of dynamic we've set in motion. So if the current administration is voted out of office come November, that struggle is not going to be over, because the current administration has cultivated a base of people who just thrill to their policies and practices. Again, I don't think that's any more than 40%, and I think that can be overcome. indeed the popular vote in the last election suggests strongly that it can, because the current occupant of the White House didn't win by popular vote, won instead in the Electoral College. But we have a long-term battle to fight in terms of restoring the functioning of the institutions of democracy and restoring the culture and the social fabric that makes democracy possible.
Well, you touched on several very important issues, as you know, we know many different significant challenges that we face these days. Can we shift gears a little bit and talk about religious leaders? What can a religious people, both leaders and lay people, what should we be doing? And how do we lead coming up to the election?
Well, you know, there too, we're all struggling to get a handle on what it means to be a religious person in the United States of America these days, because political forces have, I think, manipulated religious conviction, especially in the Christian community, which I'm a member of. So I speak as an insider, not a critical outsider. But I have a lover's quarrel with my own community and tradition that I love, a very serious lover's quarrel with certain parts of it. And, you know, I think this calls upon religious leaders to be extraordinarily vigilant and extraordinarily courageous in the kind of leadership they offer people who are eager to restore the church in its various forms to, you know, something more like the gospel, something more like what Jesus modeled. But at the same time, there's a branch of the Christian church, a fairly large and vocal branch, which has used the language, the images, the name, Jesus and Christian, in ways that have really devalued the currency, politically manipulative ways that have devalued the currency. They've been both puppets and puppeteers in this wave of whatever it is that isn't democracy. I personally think it has some pretty strong fascist tendencies, and especially and indubitably, unarguably, I think, kleptocratic and authoritarian tendencies. So I think Christian leadership is up against a lot. I thought we had, you know, I believe, and I think a lot of Christians do, that we had some very strong modeling from the bishop of the diocese in Washington, D.C., who vigorously objected to members of the current administration using that Episcopal Church as a backdrop for a display of the Bible and of federal power. That was religious pornography, if I may use the term. And that Bishop Booty, was it? I can't remember how to pronounce her name.
No, I'm not sure either.
But she had a very strong voice and a very clear message about this was unacceptable. It was, you know, manipulative of the church. It was an insult to the members of that church. That little entourage from the White House never went inside the church, never prayed. You know, clearly was trying to use the Bible as a weapon. It was the whole thing, the whole agenda was on such full display, including the military force or the federal force that was used to expel what, as far as I can tell through a lot of research and reading, was a peaceful crowd of nonviolent protesters. The same kind of protesters we just remembered with deep admiration and gratitude when John Lewis died and lay in state in the US Capitol. Those same kinds of nonviolent demonstrators on the streets of Washington, D.C. were tear gassed and pushed back quite vigorously by armed and masked individuals who represent a police state, or who simulated a police state. So I think the religious leaders in mosques and in temples and in churches and in Quaker meetings and all across the board have to come out strong as the Bishop of Washington did. And while always trying to mediate, between factions, also making it clear that there are boundary conditions to this business of claiming a religious affiliation, and they shouldn't be too hard to determine. In my own tradition, it's love, truth, and justice, and all of them equally important. And every one of them, it seems to me, has been violated in our political culture, not for the first time, but in extraordinary ways over the last 4 years. And it's in the culture at large that we can't even get our arms around what it means to be empathetic. What it means to be empathetic enough to put on a mask before we go into crowded places, when the science is inarguably aligned on the side of masks help prevent the spread of COVID-19. And all of the states that have been experiencing surges are states where that wasn't believed, but is now all of a sudden, well, that probably is a good idea. Let's see if we can do that. And way too many Americans can't. So these are, am I my brother's keeper, my sister's keeper? Well, yeah, I think I am. It's not just something that my tradition tells me, but it's something that makes all kinds of sense to me, because I wouldn't be here if other people hadn't regarded themselves as my keeper. So it's, pay it forward, pass the gift along. People have supported us, we should support other people. And it's, if one expression of that is wear a mask, or don't drink and drive, or don't drive over 50 miles an hour when that's what the speed limit says, or don't shout fire in a crowded theater, those are pretty basic boundary conditions. And I find it inexcusable that anybody who's claiming an identity in the stream of one of the great world religions would think, nah, I'm free to do what I want. God will take care of me. What's going to happen to all the other people? Who cares? I mean, if they don't believe in my way, then they can take the highway. It's religious leaders, I think, sometimes try to moosh things a little by being claiming to be on the side of bridge building and reconciliation, when there's also another side of boundary maintenance, and reminding people that no, it's not the case that anything goes. I've for years I've spoken and written about this notion: one truth for you, another truth for me, and never mind the difference. The first time I heard that phrase, like, I don't know, 40 or 50 years ago, I said to the person who was speaking it, who was trying to use that as a way to get out of a conflicted conversation, I said, no, that's not the way it works. I mind the difference between your truth and my truth very much, and you should too, because we live in the same world. And your truth has an impact on me, my truth has an impact on you. Let's talk. Let's work this out, because we don't live in hermetically sealed bubbles. So I think that's one way of thinking about religious leadership. I don't envy people that role. It's got to be very, very tough today. But I think most grown-up people know that in that world, that following a path of integrity is the most rewarding thing ultimately that you can do.
So Parker, just to finish up, for whoever wins the election, what advice do you have?
Stay on your feet. Be in it find ways to be in it for the long haul. Realize that you can't do this by yourself, and do everything you can to build coalitions, not only within the government, but among we the people. I would hope that eventually politicians could stop obsessing about their bases and talk more about we the people, whom they are supposed to represent, albeit with a particular emphasis on their own local constituency. But everyone who serves on Capitol Hill has taken an oath to defend the Constitution, and the Constitution is all about we the people. It doesn't talk about political bases and polling data and all of the things that so many politicians spend really half their time and energy on, including raising money to appeal to their base. So I think that, ultimately, the leadership that really counts is leadership that walks the talk, or leadership that embodies the values, embodies the good words that all leaders speak. I think those people stand as people who are able to do that, stand as an example, an embodied example to all of us who, as citizens, want somebody of integrity to follow. We want to know that what we see is what we get. We want to know that there aren't dozens of backroom deals going on, or papers being hidden away, secrets that will come out only when the history of a political era is written 10, 20, 30 years later. So what you embody, I think, counts for a lot. I think we've learned that in the last 4 years, because what's been embodied ain't very pretty, and it ain't very attractive, and it ain't very democratic, it ain't very honest. It's frankly tacky and more thuggish than leaderly. So those are things that I would hope the next president will keep in mind. And I hope most of all that the American people will keep in mind when they cast their votes, understanding that yes, they want a government that functions. They don't want a government where the deep state, which means civil servants who do important jobs, has been rooted out and tossed on the trash heap. But they want a government that functions well enough so that they can get that $600 supplementary income check or unemployment check, which so many need right now, but with the deep state so badly wounded, put that in quotes, civil servants so badly decimated, they can't even get that. And so a lot of rebuilding to do, but I think it all comes down. It's not that the president can do everything, but it's that the president can represent a lot of things that we want and need and have a right to expect in a constitutional republic that surrounds a representative democracy.
Well, Parker, as always, it's such a pleasure to be able to discuss these important issues with you. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do that with us today.
Well, thank you, Brian, for caring about these questions. I really appreciate that. And again, good to be with you.